Lack of compromise in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has led to worsening poverty rates for Palestinians and tremendous loss of life in the region. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict is often framed as a conflict that has been raging for centuries and stems from religious differences, but the truth is far from that. The conflict began in the 19th century and stems from the differences between two groups of people, Israelis and Palestinians, due to issues of land ownership. Neither side has been able to compromise throughout the long and troubled history of the conflict, which has resulted in thousands of deaths. A compromise between both sides seemed near at several peace talks, but a lack of willingness to compromise led to the continuation of the conflict. Most consider the beginning of the conflict to coincide with the creation of the Jewish state in Palestine in 1947, after World War II and the creation of the Israeli state. However, there were conflicts and skirmishes before then. In the 1900s, the land that is the center of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict belonged to the Ottoman Empire, which used to be a relatively peaceful area where Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived together. However, after World War I, Britain gained ownership of the land and separated the citizens of the Ottoman Empire by religion to divide and conquer, fueling tension between all three groups. Soon, Zionist Jews who believed in the creation of a Jewish state began to move into British-controlled Palestine, and conflicts between the Jews and Palestinians in Palestine began to break out. And Britain believed that the ownership of Palestine was not worth the trouble. Britain gave the United Nations the Palestinian land. In 1947, the UN devised a plan to divide the land into a state for Jews, Israel, and a state for Palestinians, Palestine, with Jerusalem as an international zone. The Jews accepted the plan, but neighboring Arab states did not agree with the acquisition of the land. These Arab states invaded Israel in order to create a unified Palestinian state, but were defeated by Israel. However, Israel moved far past its UN borders after the Arab-Israeli War and took much of the land which was supposed to belong to Palestine, evicting many Palestinians from their homes in the process. The war left the Palestinians stateless, and they have been stateless ever since. In 1967, war between Israel and neighboring Arab states broke out once more in what is now called the Six-Day War. Israel was victorious and gained full control of the area and much land around the area, including the Sinai Peninsula. After the war, the conflict in the region didn't involve the many Arab states in the area, for the most part. In response to Israel's creation of settlements and the oppression and annexation of the Palestinian people by the Israelis, Palestinians launched the first of two intifadas, an Arabic word meaning tremor, in 1987. The Intifada began with boycotts on Israeli goods and services, but several controversial incidents sparked protests and riots. Tires were burned, Molotov cocktails and rocks were thrown at Israelis, and the violence continued. Israelis responded with greater military force with their armed guards, which sparked more protests and violent riots. Palestinians began to realize that they were outmatched militarily. Palestinian leaders joined together to form the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO, with Yasser Arafat as its leader. Toward the end of 1988, Arafat announced intentions of peace, and then, in 1992, Yitzhak Rabin was elected as Prime Minister of Israel, a leader who also supported peace efforts and peace talks. Because Arafat and Rabin both pushed for peace, the Oslo negotiations came to be. Other agreements occurred before the Oslo negotiations, but had little success in terms of direct peace between Israel and Palestine. The Oslo Agreement focused on direct agreement between leading officials in Israel and Palestine, and was the first to do so. Palestine was represented by the PLO, although Palestine, which has never been formed as a concrete state, had no definite leader at the time, and struggles between different factions of Palestine leadership groups have occurred. This uncertain power dynamic in Palestine hampers peace talks. Some leaders or citizens of both nations may want peace, but the decision ultimately lies in the hands of a few. The Oslo negotiations were signed on the White House lawn in 1993 by the leader of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, and the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Yitzhak Rabin. The agreement planned for Israel to withdraw troops from Palestinian territory in stages, then for the creation of an interim government for 5 years, before the final goal of the establishment of a permanent Palestinian state would occur. However, few of these changes came to pass, in part due to terrorist groups in Palestine such as Hamas, which launched suicide bombings against Israelis. Some Israeli groups did not accept the agreement as well. Like many other agreements before it, this agreement was unsuccessful. 7 years passed from the Oslo agreements before the next major summit for peace talks between Israel and Palestine, the Camp David summit in 2000. Before then, a series of unsuccessful meetings occurred which attempted to continue the process of the Oslo Accords. The Camp David talks in 2000 are considered by many to be the closest that Israel and Palestine came to peace. The talks were comprehensive and spanned a fortnight, but in the end, they failed. Sources claim that the reason that an agreement was not reached was because the maximum Israel offered was less than the minimum the Palestinians could accept. Israel offered large areas of land, including the Gaza Strip and most of the West Bank, while refusing to cede East Jerusalem and areas where Israel had established settlements. Bill Clinton, the mediator of the peace talks, praised Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak for his willingness to compromise. I would be making a mistake not to praise Barak, because I think he took a big risk. The Prime Minister moved forward more from his initial position than Chairman Arafat, particularly surrounding the question of Jerusalem. However, the issue of Jerusalem was the issue that ended any hope of a compromise. Leader of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, held fast and did not accept a compromise, even though Israel offered much. This led, ultimately, toward greater suffering of the Palestinian people as time went on, as Israel encroached on Palestinian land and continued to oppress the Palestinian people. On the Israeli side, Barak was met with condemnation from the Israeli people for offering too much, while Arafat was considered globally as the reason that no agreement was reached. The conflict continued after the peace talks, with greater violence occurring in part due to anger that no peace deal was able to be reached. The Second Intifada was launched, and conflicts resembled the First Intifada: Palestinian protests, riots, and terrorist attacks, and Israeli airstrikes and military responses. However, many reasons, not just anger due to the lack of an official state, lead to violence in the region. There are many ways in which Israeli government and police harass Palestinians and hamper the peace process, such as routine border checks that purposely slow down travel, violent crackdowns on protests, the establishment of Israeli settlements in Palestinian territory, and frequent attacks and airstrikes that often come without warning. These airstrikes can have devastating effects on Palestinian communities. All of these issues lead to a high unemployment and high poverty rate, which contributes to hopelessness, in which the only way out that some Palestinians can see is through violence. The conflict that has continued due to the lack of a compromise has resulted in over 20,000 Jewish Israeli casualties and over 90,000 Arab Palestinian casualties. The Israeli government's establishment of settlements are especially controversial and connect to many other oppressive practices by the Israeli government. The first Israeli settlers settled in the West Bank after the Six-Day War, without permission or help from the Israeli government. They wanted to reclaim their Jewish homeland in the West Bank, and decided that they would begin to do so by establishing settlements in the region. The UN fought back against this move with Resolution 446, which states that settlements have no legal validity, and declares them as serious obstructions to comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in the Middle East. However, this move has done little to slow the growth of settlements. Approximately 600,000 Israelis are now settlers in Palestinian territory, and settlements are often created with the help of the Israeli government. These settlements make the creation of a Palestinian state more difficult. Any process would have to take into account the Israelis who live on the land as well. Israeli settlements are often supported by the government, with settlements being funded to the extent that settlers often have a higher quality of life than those in the older territories of Israel. Roads created between settlements are often used to create checkpoints, harass, and stop Palestinians, while Israelis are often given easy access. The creation of settlements and the use of roads and checkpoints to slow Palestinians actively slows the economy. The poor Palestinian economy breeds poverty and violence, and moves hope of a solution further away. The failure from both Israel and Palestine to reach a compromise has led to more poverty, violence, death, and destruction in the region.